Hey guys and girls, so as you have maybe noticed by now, I am primarily a bladesmith. I make knives, and my favorite type of knife to make are pocket knives, but I do make buoys and swords and everything else you can imagine as well. But bladesmithing has really captured me. I started out as a blacksmith, but bladesmithing really, gave me the fizz, and so I stuck with it largely. And while these days I can make stuff like this, and I do that as my full-time job now, I started out as a hobbyist making stuff like this and this. And that was only about 5 years ago that I started making knives. And in that time, I heard a lot of people telling me a lot of, frankly, lies about bladesmithing. And because they came from seemingly experienced makers, I believed them for a long time. What I've come to learn over the years of making knives and making a name for myself making knives is that while by and large the community for knife makers is one of the most supportive and encouraging out there, there is a lot of really toxic misinformation out there about bladesmithing and knife making in general. So I wanted to debunk a few of the more common toxic myths that you will hear, toxic lies that might poison your knife-making ears if you are a beginner getting into the craft. Things that might otherwise discourage you to hear, and hopefully this video helps set a few things straight. I'm expecting this to inflame a lot of people's minds, the sorts of, specifically the people who tend to propagate these toxic myths, but that's the risk I take by putting out an inflammatory video like this. The point of this video is to help encourage new makers and not try to scare them off. So let's get started with the first myth. So the first big myth is about quenchants. Now, people who say you have to use this quenchant or you have to use that quenchant are usually talking about ideal quenchants. And there's a big difference between a quenchant you can and can't use and a quenchant that's ideal or not ideal. So there's lots of different things out there, and a lot of beginner makers, when they start out with canola oil. And a lot of people like to shit on that and say that's terrible and you shouldn't do it, blah, blah, blah. The fact is, canola oil works just fine as a quenchant. It's great, it's cheap and readily available, but what it is not is it's not an ideal quenchant. So what do I mean by that? When you quench carbon steel, please excuse the roosters. When you quench carbon steel, it hardens, and it hardens to a measurable value that we call a Rockwell value. So when they talk about an ideal quenchant, they're talking about a quenchant that, under the right heating parameters and knife thickness and time, soak time and all that sort of thing, under all of the ideal settings for that specific steel, a particular quenchant is the one that will take it from its high temperature to its quenched temperature within the right space of time. And so it needs to be prepared to the right preheated oil, etc., to make all that happen. There's a lot of factors that go into making the ideal hardness. So canola oil in that regard is, it's pretty bad because it's really hard to control, where it's going to harden your steel to, what value. However, what it will do is it will harden your steel. Most commonly available steels that you will have access to, things like old files, which are usually going to be something like 1095 or W2, tool steels like 1080, 1084, 1075, 1070, they'll all harden just fine in canola oil. Just 5160, SUP9, spring steels like that, they're going to harden just fine in canola oil. They're going to harden just fine, and they're going to make a serviceable knife if you do the rest of your heat treatment properly and if you normalize the blade properly and things. There's so many factors that go into making a good blade that completely dismissing something like canola oil as being you should not use it is just dismissive. Frankly, it works fine. It's just will only get you, like, say, to 62 Rockwell when you could have gotten to 64 if you used the ideal quenchant. That's all. So as an extra pro tip, my sword quench tank is all canola oil, and I preheat it and it works just fine. And I've done some pretty exceptional stress tests on swords quenched in that canola oil, and it's worked great. So I also have another one here of rice bran oil. And if you are a canola oil user because you're a beginner and you don't know any better, I may offer a suggestion of switching out that canola oil for rice bran oil. It's just as easy to get a hold of in large quantities as canola oil is. However, you may have noticed when you quench in canola oil, there's a lot of flame and a lot of smoke. Rice bran oil won't flame up and smoke anywhere near as much as canola oil, so it's a bit safer. In terms of its quenchant properties, it's pretty much the same. So feel comfortable quenching your knife in canola oil or rice bran oil until you get a little more knowledgeable about the process of making knives and understanding what's going on during the quench. And I do highly recommend doing that. The next myth that I want to talk to you about and debunk is using grinding aids or grinding jigs. So you'll hear a lot of knife makers say, "Oh, I never used jigs, I learned to freehand. If you can't freehand, you're not a real knife maker." That's horseshit. I like to use file guides. I have this carbide faced file guide from Nordic Edge. I really like this one. Its carbide faces are bolted on, so they can't fall off. A lot of them you find are epoxied on. And this allows me to get nice crispy plunge lines like this, because when it's attached to the blade, the belt physically cannot go past the carbide faces, so it's nice and matched up on either side. It's just peace of mind, and it saves me a lot of work, because one slip while freehand grinding can completely ruin a very expensive piece of Damascus or something that you've invested a lot of time in up until that point. And if you want to go even further, if you're not particularly comfortable holding angles for bevel grinding, you can also get grinding jigs. And this one's also from Nordic Edge and even works together with the file guide. And you can get perfect grinds every time with it. I don't use this one as much, but I do like having it for those projects where it really, really matters. But all it does is it holds the bevel angle for you so that the natural movement of your body doesn't mess with it. Simple as that. It's not cheating to use this. It doesn't make you less of a knife maker or less of a man to use a guide like this. And anything that is telling you otherwise is frankly just toxic masculinity saying you're not a real man if you can't freehand your grinds, which is childish. It's the sort of thing you hear in high school, frankly. So use as many grinder jigs and aids and helpers as you feel comfortable needing. It doesn't make you any less of a knife maker. One myth that particularly grinds my gears is one that blames people for using quote-unquote beginner steels and says, using sort of like baby steels, training wheel steels, things like 1080 and 1084. 1084 is an exceptional knife steel. It's really quite good. Despite being a carbon knife steel, which means it is prone to rust, it is very easy to get a good hardness from, possible to get a great hardness from if you know what you're doing, and is very easy to work. It's easy to cut, it's easy to forge, beautiful to forge. It holds together well, it normalizes very readily. It's a very, very good steel. And the fact that it is easy to use, easily accessible, and not particularly exotic does not make it any less of a good steel to use for making knives. And here's the main point about that. Almost all Damascus that you see is made of 1084 and 15N20. So mastersmiths making, ABS mastersmiths are making Damascus knives using 1084. Can't be that much of a beginner steel now, can it? And speaking of the ABS, another big toxic thing that goes on is comparing everything that everybody makes to ABS standards. If you're not familiar, the ABS is the American Bladesmithing Society. It's a great group of people that actually focus. It was formed to try and keep alive the art of bladesmithing, which almost went extinct, at least in America, because people just weren't forging blades anymore. They were stock removing blades. And so that art was disappearing, and the society was put together in the 70s, I believe it was, in order to keep that craft alive, which is a very noble cause, and I'm very supportive of that. However, they've turned into a very large organization, and everybody, they have a series of tests that they do to reach certain levels within the ABS. And because of how prolific they are in the community, everybody starts comparing their work to ABS standards. If you are not opting to be in the ABS, those standards are irrelevant, and you need to remember that. And everybody that comments on your work needs to remember that. If people are saying that your fit and finish isn't up to standard, or certain patterns are not being followed, certain profiles for blades and things, there's a real look to ABS knives because they're all trying to work towards the same goal. If that's not the goal you're choosing for your work, that's fine. You don't have to be a joiner, so to speak, and join ABS or any other knife making guild, of which there are several around the world. So if people are trying to expect your work to come up to a standard of a group that you're not a part of, there's something wrong with that. A big one that you hear a lot, usually not from knife makers as such, but from the knife enthusiasts who tend to like to buy knives, is they think that forged knives are superior to stock removed knives, where you've used a grinder to actually remove material away from a large piece of steel to make something that is knife shaped, as opposed to forging it, which is on a actual metallurgical level more or less nonsense. Dr. Larrin Thomas, very, very smart man, and somebody who's dedicated his life to studying everything there is to do with knives and knife making and metallurgy around knife making, wrote an incredible online article about this, which I'll link below. He did find one small main difference between forged knives and stock removed knives. The difference was not noticeable enough to warrant the extra work. If you're going to forge knives, that's great. If you're going to stock remove knives, that's great. Neither of those makes you more or less of a knife maker, because let's face it, if you have forged a knife, once you've finished forging it, what do? You take it to a grinder and you grind off with all of the forge marks and make it look all shiny again. So you're just stock removing as well. It's just removing a step. The next myth concerns your forge. Now, there's people who have done dedicated their entire career to using solid fuel forges like charcoal or coke. And there are people who have dedicated their entire career to using gas forges like this. There are people that now use induction forges in order to do it. Some very high-profile people have done sort of smear campaigns against the old school ways of doing things, such as Alex Steele. He may have changed his mind since then, since he has actually done a bit of coal forging since then. But I'm one of the people that gets regular comments from people saying that coal forging is Stone Age and move with the times, and its gas forges are superior in every way and blah, blah, blah. They're not, just empirically not. A coal forge will work bigger pieces than a gas forge. A coal forge, you can make the fuel for at home compared to a gas forge. A coal forge is silent and doesn't require hearing protection. A coal forge will get easily hotter than almost any gas forge. Even if you're just using a little hand crank blower like this, it will outpace most gas forges with very little effort, with the exception of maybe forced air burner, ribbon burner sort of forges, which are very specific and take a lot of fuel and power to run. So how you choose to heat your steel, whether it's a gas forge, an induction forge, a oil forge, or even just simple old charcoal with a hand crank blower like this, none of that makes you a better or worse knife maker. It's simply a choice, that's all. Every single one of the options has both pros and cons. You need to find the one that works the best for you. Remember, we talked about those hardness values, the Rockwell values earlier. That's another toxic lie that's told to you all the time, that you need to achieve the maximum possible hardness of the steel that you're working with. Otherwise, you've somehow failed or made a substandard knife. Also not true, because among aficionados in the industry, we're all striving to achieve better hardness, better results, better performance out of our work, and we should. That is a noble goal, and it's a goal that I would agree that everybody in the craft should aspire to. But it should be sort of an infinite goal, one we're constantly trying to work towards. And I do encourage you to work towards it. But if you achieve a knife that only has a final Rockwell after tempering of 58, that's still going to do a halfway decent job. And once again, it depends on what it's used for, because a machete, for example, does not necessarily need to have the same hardness as a pocket knife, which does not need to have the same hardness as a chef knife, which does not need to have the same hardness as a butter knife. Depends on the knife, depends what it's going to be used for, depends how it's going to be used. Should you strive for the best possible hardness? Yes, you absolutely should. But you only need it to be the hardness of the task it's required for. That is the bare minimum of what you should achieve. And anything above that is going to be superfluous to task. And that's good. You want the thing to be superfluous to task. But by how much is going to be a matter of practice and skill and your learning and refining your technique. All of which, once again, I do encourage you to do. But never buy into this bullshit lie that if it's not peak and could be shot at and survive, everything like chopping through nails under forge presses and things like that, if it can't do that, then you've somehow failed. Just don't believe that. It's just not true. It would be remiss of me to do a video like this without a reference to this video, which I highly recommend. If you haven't watched it, please do watch it. There's a couple of cameo appearances from some very, very skilled knife makers in this, giving their 2 cents on it. But that is the whole notion of using scrap steel, of which you can see in the darkness behind me there, scrap steel over purchased bars of manufactured knife steel. So one thing you're going to hear a lot of people say is if it's made of scrap, it's going to be prone to failure. You don't know what it is. You can't get proper hardness with it. It's garbage, blah, blah, blah. The only aspect of that I agree with is if you, for example, use a leaf spring, you need to, and you're going to sell that knife, you need to tell people it was made from a leaf spring. Not say that it's a 5160 blade, because you can't know that that leaf spring was 5160 unless you get it spectroscopically analyzed, which you can do. Same with knives made from files. You can't just say, oh, that's a W2 knife. No, it's a knife made from a file. So if you had bought a bar of W2 and made a knife out of it, you can say it's a W2 knife. But outside of that, use scrap. Let's face it, the world is filling up with garbage and refuse. If you can actually repurpose some of that, not only are you helping the environment a little bit, but you're making a knife that's got a bit more of a story behind it. Because from the perspective of a customer, knowing that this thing had been reforged out of something that was now, previously garbage or useless, like an old packet of leaf springs or an old rasp or something like that, it tells a story, and that story is something that they can tell to other people that they show when they pull it out to use it in the field. So don't shy away from scrap ratting, and do check out that video. And that brings me to my last toxic lie that's told in the community, and this is a big one. I've saved this one for the last. I know that most of the people watching this are probably going to be beginners, and so most of the things that I've listed are for you guys. This one is also for the beginners to hear, but it's also just as important for the more experienced makers. This community is wonderful. It's very encouraging. It's very supportive. However, that encouragement and support can sometimes come out in very mean or discouraging ways. And I have been thinking about this for a long time and wondering why. And what I've come to the conclusion of is that certain people have their own reasons for making knives. They're on a particular journey and they're doing it a particular way for those particular reasons. And then, because they get engrossed in the craft, because it is a craft that you can easily get engrossed in, they expect that everybody else that is doing the craft is going to be doing it for exactly the same reason that they are. And it's trying to shoot for the same goals as they are, which is not always going to be the case. I, for example, my primary goal is providing for my family. That's why I make knives. But my very close second is I want to enjoy myself. I want to have fun. And I love this craft. I really do. I wake up in the morning thinking about it, and I go to bed thinking about it, and I consider that I have my dream job. And I'm lucky that I get to have my dream job. And because I work for myself, I don't have a boss. I'm a member of no guild, and because of that, I have no responsibility to anybody except to my customers. And I work very hard to try and make sure that my customers are satisfied. And the success that I've had in my business shows that they are satisfied. The fact that I don't do my craft the same way that others do the same craft does not mean that I'm doing it wrong. Also doesn't mean that they're doing it wrong. But you will get some people trying to tell you that you are doing it wrong because you're not doing it like they are. And that's what they're really saying. And it's important. This is what the final point is. It's the final lie that you will be told is that you're doing it wrong because you're not doing it the way somebody wants you to be doing it. You may both be making knives, but how you do that is up to you. So the main thing that you really want to try and do is remember to enjoy it and have fun, because it's having fun and being passionate about it that will drive you to get better and better and better, which is exactly the reason that I went from this to this in 5 years. It was passion for this craft. So that's the real message behind this video, because those sorts of toxic lies that get thrown around can be very discouraging to new makers. We don't want to scare new makers away. We want to encourage them. We want to uplift them, and we want them to do their best work, but in an encouraging and supportive way. You've got to start out making some dodgy knives before you end up making great knives. It's just how it works. We were all there. Not everybody came out of the gate making great stuff. So that's pretty much that for the video. Big thank you to my Patreon supporters for helping make these videos possible. It really, you guys' encouragement is what gets me up to do these videos. Hopefully I have encouraged a few people to not put down the hammer and give it up, and to keep trying and keep working. Always seek to be better, but don't get discouraged by people trying to tell you these lies, because I want more and more people to join this craft, and I want them to enjoy this craft and have a good time. Anyway, that's it from me. I'll catch you all on the flip side. Bye.
So blue wind warmed in and out of the storm. Night birds sung high on the rising tide, and barefoot we played beside